For those that don't know, we closed two new assets in the last couple weeks here: Park Place, which is a 64 unit in Johnson City, Tennessee, and the flats at Rutgers, formerly Valley View Apartments or Valley View Village Apartments, which is a 102 unit in Roanoke, Virginia. So the lessons learned, which one is this for? Oh, this is just in general.
Yeah.
Okay, so construction management. So one thing that I've been doing as the asset manager is I've been the COO of Tri-City Equity, so just kind of building the systems and just the back office type of building the company type stuff as a COO and the daily operations. And then I've also been the asset manager, making sure we're on track with our business plans and things like that. But then I've also been doing construction manager. And at the beginning, it wasn't too big of a problem. But as we start getting into these bigger properties, like 64 unit, 102 unit, I've really noticed the stress of needing to have a full-time construction management person in there. So I've asked around on how does this person get compensated? Do they get compensated out of the asset management fee? Does it get added into some kind of payroll for each property? Or is it something separate? And the majority of the response I got back from my peers in the industry was that construction management is tied to the construction budget, the CapEx budget. So if you have $1 million CapEx budget for a program, it would be a percentage of that, like 5 or 10% construction management fee would get added to that construction budget. And then that fee would get, drawn, either monthly or quarterly or all at once or whatever that mechanism is, to a full-time construction manager person where their whole focus is executing that CapEx and that renovation plan. That really takes the weight off the asset manager so they can focus on the overall execution of the business plan, not necessarily picking out, faucets and, backsplash tiles and those type of things, and dealing with contractors and that make sure they're on budget and doing the draws and everything like that. So that was kind of a lesson learned, is as we grow and progress, the need to having this separate construction management person, and they will be getting compensated tied to the construction management budget. So I know a lot of the people on the call aren't there yet, but it's important to have these milestones as you grow your companies, to be able to delegate out and take off some of those hats that you're wearing intentionally, so you can keep that momentum and keep the energy to keep the company growing to reach your goals. So this is just a bottleneck and a constraint that we identified with this last batch of deals. And we're talking Valley View Village, put in context, like that budget's and we have $1.5 million we're going to pump into that place of CapEx over a 1.5 year period. So it could be a full-time job, and there will be a full-time job to execute that. So that was one lesson learned. So higher contingencies, construction budget. So one thing that kind of bit me in the butt and kind of highlighted some weaknesses in my construction planning was kind of using a standard contingency with the prices. Back to kind of what we we're talking about earlier in the call was inflation. Inflation has hit the construction industry like a shotgun blast. Like the cost of labor is through the roof. The cost of materials on the most random things is through the roof. If you can even get things, we're having days or delays of 12 weeks, 15 weeks, 18 weeks just to get materials to finish a job in some cases on some obscure thing that we need for this material we need to complete a job, or just getting labor to even show up like to work is just hard enough for a lot of our subs. So that was something I didn't plan for correctly, of just how impactful that was going to be on our construction budgets. So it's causing some, we just got to be tighter now and just a lot more tighter on our budget now, because we didn't have enough buffer to withstand the hit of that inflation that's coming our way. So now going forward, higher contingencies and construction budgets, because you just don't know what supply constraint or labor constraint is gonna hit you and when it's gonna hit. Could be wood, it could be steel, it could be, drill bits. Who knows what's going to be a shortage, as these months progress. So the best thing to do is just have higher contingencies, both monetarily and timeline. Everything's going to cost more and take longer for the foreseeable future. So plan for that. This goes for, on like construction management, this goes for small jobs too. Even if you have, just a couple of units, and you're planning out your vacancy for your year. Well, if you have to flip a unit and you can't because you can't get the labor to do it, or your contractor or GC's, taking longer, you can't get a thing like an HVAC unit because they're out countrywide. That's going to affect your vacancy rates. It's going to affect your revenue because you can't fill a unit because it's vacant, because you can't put it together. So there's like this ripple effect or domino effect of this, of these constraints. So plan accordingly. I think they're going to get worse before they get better. So higher contingencies and longer times, construction times.
So for higher contingencies in construction budget, how does that affect returns on a bridge debt loan, for example?
If you use it or if you don't use it?
If you don't use it.
And it doesn't.
Yeah, so that's the nice thing about contingencies, right? Is that like it doesn't actually affect your pro forma, just to have that buffer, but it's better to have it than to not have it and need it later.
Yeah, exactly. So what Duke is talking about is, so on bridge debt, one of the best things about bridge debt is that you can often fund your construction inside the loan. So you'll have like your senior debt that you use to buy the property, and then you'll also get a construction budget that you can draw from. So if I have $1 million construction budget, I'm not paying on that $1 million in interest every month. I'm only paying on what I draw. And so it's really good to have bridge debt because of that. But if I don't say if I got this job done with $800,000, then I only pay the interest on the $800,000, and I don't use that $200,000 contingency. I don't pay interest on it. So it's better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it, because then you're gonna be into a situation where you have to do what's called capital calls, and that's where you have to go and fund money into the bank account to get things done, because of situations that either could have been preventable, or a lot of times we're seeing it was unknown. Like, who knows, we couldn't get, ACs, HVAC units were going to be, a shortage nationwide for 3 months. Like, nobody saw that coming. So best thing to do is just add higher contingencies, kind of control the variables you can control. And that's one of the things that we've learned, kind of going through this weird COVID delay issue, supply issue. So there's that. And then property condition reports. So PCR. So PCR is what we call them, kind of in more of the commercial realm, more of the residential side. It's just your property inspection report. So your property inspector will give you a report. Here's everything that's wrong with the property. Here's our recommendations or whatever. Once you get into kind of the commercial space, they change the name to property condition reports, and phase ones is another environment, is your phase one environmental. And what we saw in this instance was the firm we hired to do the PCRs was extremely competent, extremely professional, extremely detailed, to the point where they were too detailed. Because what happens is the lender requests those reports, and then they're like, okay, well, you need to fix everything that's on this list, and they use it to like almost and I can see from both sides, like the PCR company wants to show like how incredibly detailed they are, and they're going to list everything they can possibly list, because the incentive for them is so you can go and possibly negotiate with the seller some of these issues, because they're so detailed in the reports. But then that same report gets in the hands of the lender, and now the lender's like, we need to reserve, $5 million to fix all these issues, and the property is not worth it, so we can't give you the loan, or we're going to reduce your DSCR or your LTV or something like that. So that was kind of like a double-edged sword of this kind of firm that we were going with. Was their reports are extremely detailed. They're really good. If we wanted to go back and negotiate like seller credits or repairs and stuff like that because they were, that detailed. But then it started hurting us because the lender's like, we need to start reducing the LTV or something, because now your CapEx budget's too big because of all the stuff that's wrong. So kind of the solution is, make sure, get some sample reports, I guess, of your PCRs, or your inspection reports of other things. If you never worked with this company before, get some sample reports so you can, review of what's going to be in there, how it's going to be laid out, and things like that. Do they do cost estimates? Because that was specifically what was hurting us on ours, was on the report they did an executive summary with a cost estimate. Well, their cost estimate was like consistently like 30 to 40% higher than ours was, than like my actual CapEx budget. And that's what was hurting us. The lenders like, well, we have to use theirs. And I was like, but I have, I have bids from like real contractors that show it's, this job is only a $30,000 job. And he's saying it's a $50,000 job. They're like, well, it's going to cost, the lender's like, well, we have to use the 50,000, even though I'm holding a bid for 30,000. So that was kind of a little bit frustrating to kind of go through this process. So the fix of that was either have two versions, like the firm creates one version for the lender that's more of like a higher level view of the property, not compromising any of the integrity of the inspection, but just not as like granular as the one we give to the seller. So you have one that we negotiate with, and then one that we send to the lender. And that was a fix. Or just get us, as you're kind of going through companies, just get sample reports and just only have one, but just make sure it's good enough for the purpose that you're trying to achieve. So that was the big things. Let me think. Some new ones, and this is happening in real time with Park Place. So Park Place is 64 unit, Johnson City, Tennessee. It's a LIHTC property. So LIHTC is low income housing. And our play, what we do at low income housing is we transition into market either through expiration of the LORA, the land use restriction agreement, or we force it out through what's called the qualified contract. And that's what we're doing with this one, is we're going through what's called the qualified contract. Is we go to the state, we fill an application out, so we want to get out of the LIHTC program because of, here's all the reasons why. There's a new bill right now in Congress that is talking about killing the qualified contract process. So not completely, but the way that they calculate the valuation of the property is going to change drastically, which is pretty much going to kill the program. It's what they're doing. So they're not killing the program per se, they're just changing the rules to where the market's going to kill the program. It's not going to be worth it to do the program anymore. So we are very quickly trying to get our application in to the state before this bill gets passed, if it gets passed in its current state. So we are tracking that. And the lesson learned there is exactly what we did. And it wasn't so much of a lesson learned, but more of a confirmation is always have multiple exit strategies, always be very conservative in your underwriting, because stuff can change. And like I said, if we bet our business plan on only doing the qualified contract, we'd be sweating bullets right now, because the whole fate of this business plan is in, some legislatures passing this bill that is going to hurt a lot of people that are in this industry, this LIHTC kind of niche industry. So we were very conservative in underwriting. We're still going to be able to execute our business plan as planned, even if it goes through. But I'm tracking it with the CPA, with the lawyer, and we are rushing to get that application in before, or if it gets passed. We're going to try to sneak in there before that. So there's that. What's this? Is this me too? You want to do this one, Duke?
Sure. Yeah. So on the debt side, one thing we've discovered is having more guarantors hurts you, because the lenders are expecting that each guarantor is going to bring a certain amount of net worth and liquidity to the team. So they actually raise the requirements the more guarantors you have. So you really want to limit the number of guarantors on your GP team to the minimum that you need to satisfy the net worth and liquidity requirements.
And co-invest.
Yeah, and co-invest, because they
Yeah.
do require that GP co-invests a minimum of say like 10% or something of the equity. So that's huge, that each of the guarantors need to contribute to that co-invest. And the second point is to manage the lender's timeline, because they might have certain requirements that you got to meet, but they're not always going to be on it to ensure that their side actually fulfills the timeline. So the lender also has their legal team, and so that's a huge one that we had to work with them a lot to get the deal closed on time. And even then, it was a struggle because there was multiple legal teams and lots of back and forth. But ultimately, it's your responsibility as the buyer to manage that timeline and ensure that the lender is going to be able to close on time, because you, the buyer, have to deal with the seller on the contract side. So you want to make sure that all that gets done on time.
Yep. And I would say the same goes. More importantly, if it's a direct to seller deal, like there's no broker or agent involved. Like if you're just, for example, you go find somebody on Facebook that has a 10 unit and you want to go buy this, and it's like an off market deal, and you're like, holy crap, I'm going to make a home run. You turn into the agent, and you need to be very, very aware that you're the one that's going to be the one keeping everything going, and not just assuming the seller is doing everything that they need to be doing to close the deal on time. Getting everything to title, getting everything to, the lawyer, the counsel that they need to be doing. So you're going to be the one managing pretty much the timeline. And it goes, more so if it's an off-market deal, like you become the agent.
Yeah, and even if you have a mortgage broker, you can't really rely on them to do their job either. So like, you're ultimately responsible for performing on the loan and the loan application and all that. So if they drop the ball, you pretty much have to pick it up, even though you got to pay them a fee. So you really want to manage that whole process, like, and ensure that everything gets done, even if the certain team players are not contributing.
Yeah, we had one of ours did Valley View got delayed through the weekend, right? We closed on Monday. Yeah, so we had ours, like, we're talking a $8 million transaction, and their lawyer didn't even pick up like their pen until like we were supposed to close on Friday, and they called on Wednesday like, we're not ready to close. And we're like, where have you been? Literally the last like 6 months. And like, he's calling us like 2 days before closing, like there's no way we can close on time. And I'm like, oh, like it was an absolute nightmare those last couple of days, like, because we just assumed that the seller side of the table, their counsel, their lawyers, their title was doing everything that needed to get done. And they said it was like 48 hours to closing, found out like they just started like drafting documents. And so that's where this is coming from, of like, you just need to be like the overbearing, person, squeaky wheel, to the point where you're just frustrating everybody, but it'll get the job done.
And the same thing too, right? Like in terms of the lender's timeline, like even if you have a broker, like let's say quote unquote representing you on your side of the transaction, it works the same way, because they're not necessarily gonna take charge. Although that would be your expectation, it's the same thing. Like you still need to kind of manage that timeline and those expectations up front.
Yep. Yeah. So Vince already touched on the managing the seller's counsel, but in any of these larger commercial deals, there's like counsel, there's legal teams for every principal, and then more legal teams on top of that for other things like SEC. And if you need like an opinion letter in a certain state like New York, like our loan is going to be securitized, which is why they need to be under New York law. So we have to get an opinion letter from a New York lawyer, even though there's nothing having to do with New York about the deal at all. So yeah, there's a lot of legal teams that you have to coordinate. And yeah, essentially as the buyer, you have to be the quarterback of all those legal teams to make sure that everybody does their job. Yeah. And then about the PSA to the purchase and sale agreement, when drafting it, you want to make sure that all the terms that are favorable to the buyer are included in the PSA. And you can't assume that it's going to be there. So you really have to go through the document carefully and make sure that all the clauses that are favorable to you actually make it to the PSA.
This is where if you're coming from the residential side, you have to be aware of that, because the assumption in the commercial space is that you know what you're doing, versus on the residential side, there's a lot of protections that are typically built into residential contracts that favor, they're typically pretty buyer friendly, giving you many exit points. So, but that's not necessarily the case on commercial. So yeah, just to Duke's point, you need to control all of that purchase and sale agreement, make sure what you want is actually in that agreement.
What are some examples of, I guess, buyer friendly verbiage?
Like documents, right? Like, so if you request a list of documents from the seller, you want to make sure that your timeline is tied to the receipt of those documents and not just to some other timeline, like 5 days after execution. Because if the seller delays in getting you documents, then you can't finish your due diligence. So you want to ensure that you have all the documents on a timely basis and then tie everything to that moment.
Mm-hmm. And other common ones are like extensions, the right to get an extension. A lot of these contracts will have you have a 30-day due diligence period before your EMD goes hard, and that money's gone. But what happens if the inspector your third party inspector is delayed, or some contractor that's going to scope some lines or something like that, they can't get out there for 3 weeks, and then you're scrambling. You have 3 days to get the inspection done and make enough shrewd investment decision if you're going to stay in this deal or not, because you're rushing against the clock and you have nothing built into the contract to extend your EMD or extend your due diligence. So then your EMD goes hard and you're in, that's sunk cost. So that kind of things of having the right to do maybe a 30-day due diligence, but have the right to essentially buy another 30 days for some nominal fee, or additional EMD. I mean, not a fee, an additional EMD, because there's so many things that are out of your control now, and it's just multiplied by this kind of COVID world where it's a surveyor. Every one of our surveyors in the last 4 deals have been 6 weeks out. So how are we supposed to make a good decision in 4 weeks if we can't even get our inspectors out there till 6 weeks, right? So you're going to have to build in those protections and fight for them to have them in there. And there's some that we wouldn't cave on, and that'd be one of them.
And you want to make sure you choose your title office, especially if you're dealing directly with the seller, because not all title offices are the same as far as competence and the ability to stick with the timeline, because there's a lot of back end stuff that you really need to manage. So having competent title is key.
Also, if you're buying here from Hawaii, let them know that you are not their local, and that you're going to need to have some extra provision for buying at a distance. Most of the time, if you're not buying, if we're here, you're very likely not buying multifamily here in Hawaii. But yeah, let them know that, because you need that lead time in order to get documents back and forth. If they need wet signatures or scanning documents in, if that works. So just making sure that they have that understanding. They know where you're at to be able to work with your time zone and mailing time and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, like for example, y'all on island, there's no such thing as overnight FedEx there. So you literally have to remind the title company 10 times, throughout the process. I'm not there. I can't come in and sign. I don't have overnight FedEx. You need a 48 to 72 hour window for literally anything that they need to have in their hand, original copy. And it's you constantly have to be telling them that, because they're gonna forget. So it's, yeah, building that extra cushion for that stuff. You don't want a closing delayed because they need to have originals in hand, and there's literally no FedEx option on island to do that within 48 hours.
And if you have boots on the ground in your partnership, then you want to create some kind of power of attorney to have an authorized signatory that is on the mainland that can sign on behalf of your partnership, because that will help cut down on some of the paperwork and closing documents that the rest of the team elsewhere would need to submit.
Good stuff.